of Welty's historic home. Reservations are recommended, though, as capacity for that is limited. And I hope you'll come back next Wednesday for History is Lunch, when Daphne Chamberlain will present the 60th anniversary of the Jackson Children's Crusade. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Maryemma Graham to discuss her long-awaited new book, The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker. Maryemma Graham is University Distinguished Professor in the Department of English at the University of Kansas. In 1983, she founded the History of Black Writing at the University of Mississippi, and since 1998, both she and that program have been at the University of Kansas. Graham earned her BA in English and Journalism from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, her MA in English from Northwestern University, her MPS from Cornell University, and her PhD from Cornell in English. She is the author of 12 books, this is the newest, including The Cambridge History of African American Literature with Jerry W. Ward, Jr. Help me welcome Maryemma Graham.
Good morning. How is everybody? Please come in and have a seat. It is wonderful to be here and to see you. This museum is amazing. I have been following its development from the very beginning, the debates, the sessions that we had with the community. I really love the way that public engagement was at the very front of this museum, bringing people together to talk about the how, the what, the when, and the value that it would bring. But so being here is really important to me. I want to thank those who invited me to come. I want to thank the Margaret Walker Center. Robbie Luckett is here. And I want to just say thank you to Mississippi, period. It has been very much a center of my life. Two of my children were born in Mississippi, in Pontotoc, Mississippi, a hospital that had one working doctor. It was a great experience and the best health care I've had. And I'm just, as I said, delighted to come back and to bring Margaret Walker back. So that's what I'm hoping to do today. So I cannot talk about Margaret Walker without this sort of footnote. The most famous person nobody knows. It's not my word, it's the words of others. Nikki Giovanni, who said that and gave me sort of the tagline for the work that I knew I had to do. But wherever I go, I want people to hear Margaret Walker.
For my people everywhere, singing their slave songs repeatedly, their dirges and their ditties and their blues and jubilees, praying their prayers nightly to an unknown God, bending their knees humbly to an unseen power. For my people, lending their strength to the years, to the gone years, and the now years, and the maybe years. Washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, dragging along, never gaining, never reaping, never knowing, and never understanding. For my playmates in the clay and dust and sand of Alabama backyards, playing, baptizing, and preaching, and doctor, and jail, and soldier, and school, and mama, and cooking, and playhouse, and concert, and store, and hair, and Miss Chumby, and company. For the cramped, bewildered years we went to school, to learn to know the reasons why, and the answers to, and the people who, and the places where, and the days when. in memory of the bitter hours when we discovered we were black and poor and small and different, and nobody cared, and nobody wondered, and nobody understood. For the boys and girls who grew in spite of these things to be man and woman, to laugh and dance and sing and play and drink their wine and religion and success, to marry their playmates and bear children, and then die of consumption and anemia and lynching. For my people, thronging 47th Street in Chicago and Lenox Avenue in New York and Rampart Street in New Orleans, lost, disinherited, dispossessed, and happy people, filling the cabarets and taverns and other people's pockets, needing bread and shoes and milk and land and money and something all our own. For my people, walking blindly, spreading joy, losing time being lazy, sleeping when hungry, shouting when burdened, drinking when hopeless, tied and shackled and tangled among ourselves by the unseen creatures who tower over us omnisciently and laugh. For my people, blundering and groping and floundering in the dark of churches and schools and clubs and societies, associations and councils and committees and conventions, distressed and disturbed and deceived and devoured by money-hungry, glory-craving leeches, preyed on by facile force of state and fad and novelty, by false prophet and holy believer. For my people, standing staring, trying to fashion a better way from confusion, from hypocrisy and misunderstanding, trying to fashion a world that will hold all the people, all the faces, all the Adams and Eves, and their countless generations. Let a new earth rise. Let another world be born. Let a bloody peace be written in the sky. Let a second generation full of courage issue forth. Let a people loving freedom come to growth. Let a beauty full of healing and the strength of final clenching be the pulsing in our spirits and our blood. Let the martial songs be written. Let the dirges disappear. Let a race of men now rise and take control.
And that was Margaret Walker. I usually say when I talk about Margaret Walker that she always had the last word, and so this would normally come at the end of a talk, but I felt like for Mississippi, we have to start with Margaret Walker. Not the last word, the first and the last word. So this is the first word. I want you to hear her voice. But as I said, why is she the most famous person? Nobody knows. Everybody knows that poem. That poem has won poetry reading contests for people like me, young in school. It still is a favorite in that tradition for those of you who have experienced those contests with young people. It has been called an anthem, the poem of the century. It, of course, is an award. It was the title of the award-winning book, For My People, that was published in 1942. So there's no question that she is not a known quantity. But there is some issue in 2023 that Walker does not have the recognition, the appeal, the important sense of place and time that we think she deserves. So my goal in writing the biography was to really give people why she did become and should remain one of the most famous people that we know. For those of you who are perhaps new to Margaret Walker, know of her, but maybe did not know her, two things. You'll notice that the cover of the book has an older woman. I felt that people who would have remembered her would remember her as an older woman. Also, I was grateful to Carolyn Brown because she did a wonderful first biography which really gives the youth story, the young story, the young woman. And therefore, this was a story for me to be able to give Walker's through line as the woman that Jackson, Mississippi knew, if they knew her at all. She would look more like that. But this is, of course, the picture of Margaret Walker in her prime. A picture that was taken by a professional photographer. You'll see Jubilee sitting on the table, which of course is that very famous book of hers. But these slides that I want to go through now are intended just to refresh your memory or introduce others of you to who Margaret Walker was. So, brief biography here. She is a 20th century figure, 1915 to 1998. Most of her life was spent in Jackson, Mississippi, though she was born in Birmingham and grew up in New Orleans. This, thanks to Ms. Stewart at the Margaret Walker Center, I'm able to show you an image of Gilbert Academy and New Orleans University, the schools that Walker was educated in her early years, and that gave her foundation for all the things that she would become and the person she would want to be, because she had expressed those. So Gilbert Academy, New Orleans University, was a historically black institution in New Orleans. It is today Dillard University, those of you who know New Orleans. But there's an effort to at least keep the memory of these institutions alive as they were, and so I've inserted this slide so people will see more of that history as well as read and study it. So, the poetry and fiction by Margaret Walker, starting with her first award-winning book, 1942, For My People, and it looked like that. You see that it won and was published in the Yale series of Younger Poets Award. 1966 was the next time we saw a major book by Walker in print, although she was publishing poems and articles in periodicals during that time. But this is the next big push by Margaret Walker, and you'll see that I put 2 copies of the Jubilee, the 50th anniversary in 2016, and then of course the original publication in 1966. But these are the books of poems and the fiction that Walker produced during her lifetime in poetry and fiction. Nonfiction, which is how I got to get pretty much up close and personal with Walker. Assisted her with several of these books. The Conversations, of course, she worked with Nikki Giovanni. The book that was perhaps the most controversial was her biography of another Mississippian, Richard Wright, the demonic genius. How I Wrote Jubilee and On Being Female, Black, and Free are the two edited collections of essays that I helped her with when I came to the University of Mississippi in the late 80s. And the conversations we published, of course, after Walker had passed. So this is the nonfiction. And the recordings. You just heard one of those recordings that was done in 1974. And so we have that voice from 1974. And you see she did other things as well. She read Langston Hughes. She read Paul Laurence Dunbar and Langston Hughes. So we have Walker very much involved in that poetry reading tradition in the 20th century, and the Smithsonian Folkways album got her to read some of the famous poems and poets of that era. But these are very old pieces that have now been remastered, and we get them again. But the voice is not quite the voice that Margaret Walker had. You heard, but it is a little slightly different, but it is an important preserve for us to know how she sounds. But she was doing recordings. About Margaret Walker, not a lot in terms of book form. This is one of the privately published works that very few people know about. It was in response to the suit against Alex Haley, and a doctor published it in Detroit because she was constantly giving speeches, and he felt that we needed to preserve what she was saying and the reasons that she did it. So it was a private publication, but I counted, and not widely distributed, but I counted among her publications. The ones that we do know, but it was about the case itself. Then Jacqueline Carmichael is the only book-length study of Jubilee. I collected the essays that had been written about Walker's work into a volume, Fields Watered with Blood. All the titles that I use in my work have all come from Margaret Walker herself. And then, of course, the biography that Carolyn Brown has done. And that was in time for, of course, the centennial. So, who is Margaret Walker? A 20th century figure that is identified with every major movement in the 20th century. The tail end of the Harlem, we call the Harlem Renaissance, where she met Langston Hughes, who pushed and encouraged, especially to get her out of the South, to get a broader education. But one of the first major influences or influencers that she became part of is this Southside Writers Group. So I usually do this when I do the students. I ask them how many of these people they can identify. Most people can't identify anybody, but I've given you the names here at the bottom to see who's here. There's Margaret Walker on the left. If you look at that, there's Richard Wright. You'll see that. But these are people who were influencers, that word we use today, in the 1930s. And they were together in a writing group in Chicago. And that is where she became very much politicized, where she learned much of what was guiding writers at the time. This was an era of tremendous conflict and transformation and change, and Walker was in the centerpiece of that in Chicago. But this is my rendition of the Southside Writers Group. I pulled the pictures together so she would know who these people were. People dropped in sometimes. They met for about 2 years, regular sessions, debating ideology, reading their literature, but Walker was central to that. Richard Wright founded it, but he left, and Margaret Walker was in charge after he left. So this is a great period of her life, important period of sort of the beginning, because this preceded her early publications, formal publications. So the next time most people knew Margaret Walker, after 1942, when, of course, For My People was published, was with Jubilee. Now, I love this scene because this is what we begin to see Margaret Walker identified with. She was well known. This is at Jackson State University in the library. And as you can see, in 1966, everybody's coming to sign a copy of, for her to sign a copy of Jubilee. In fact, we have one person in the audience who helped to type that manuscript. So this is appropriate for you to be here today. But this is that moment when she published that book, and she did it not in New York, not in Chicago, but in Jackson, Mississippi at Jackson State University. Now, Walker was this significant figure who was known for event-producing activities that had so much power and impact on large numbers of people. The Phyllis Wheatley Festival in 1973 was one of them. She brought this group of women poets and lots of other people. I was at that conference. I was not sure what I was going to do as I was completing undergraduate school and going to college. But when I came to Mississippi and saw this, I knew that my work was going to be centered around mapping this literary revolution that we saw emerging at that time. So the influence of Walker on me is central. But this is an image, Roy Lewis, the photographer, of the women that she invited who came to that festival. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the celebration of the 50th anniversary of this festival will be this November, 1st through 4th at Jackson State, and I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that, and Robbie Luckett is here, and he can do a plug on that. But these are the poets from that period. Now, of course, we have 5 times as many people today, but these are the poets who were really well known during that period, and they all came to honor Phyllis Wheatley, the first published writer in these United States, Black author, the first one in 1773. Another scene that I like to show, this is again, bookstore, Jackson State. You see people crowded looking for books. This is not New York or Chicago. This is Jackson, Mississippi in 1973. So the festival brought writers together, and you had their books, and everybody was clamoring for them. So Walker was an innovator. What she would often say is that what she thought of, she would do. If she could think it, she could do it. In this case, this 10th anniversary of the celebration of Jubilee was transformed into a folk opera. And people came to Mississippi where it was premiered. And people of significant note came to this opening. And so it was produced by Opera South. I don't know if any of you remember Opera South. Anybody in here remember Opera South? Okay. So it was one of the productions of Opera South, the adaptation of Jubilee to a folk opera. That tradition has continued. That is adaptations of Jubilee with music. And so, again, this idea that it didn't simply have to be a book, it could be translated into something else, has continued. Walker's mentor. This is a Chicago scene during the Black Arts Movement. Walker was very much wedded to the idea of mentoring. She was an educator. And this mentorship included her regular visits to Chicago. So this is a group of Chicago writers gathered in the 60s and 70s, and she constantly was in touch. Many of those were at the festival, but that relationship continued. Walker has mentored not only for her students at Jackson State or people like me who encountered her in other parts of her life, but for other poets as well. I like this scene because this is what I call Walker, the producer, the intellectual, the public intellectual, we call them today. I believe this is a studio scene. People are taping this conversation among Black women at the festival in 1973. And let me see if I can remember all the names here. I'm going to be, Robbie, you might have to help me here. Viney Burroughs on the left, Ida Lewis, who founded Encore magazine, I think, Encore. Dorothy Porter Wesley, the famous librarian from Howard University. Margaret Walker in deep thought, as you can see. This is, okay, can you help me? It's, it'll come back to me. Doris Saunders, some of you remember her from here at Jackson State. And Paula Giddings, who's going to be with us again in November for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Wheatley Festival. So you have this multi-generational panel of women talking about issues of their time, and it was being videotaped. 1973. That's why they're in a studio. I like this idea of Walker being sort of the generational inspiration for so many different people. These are names and images that you might remember. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis and James Baldwin. This is a period of time that Walker was in her heyday. She came to the festival. She's the grande dame, as you can see, at this 1986 festival. Toni Morris is in the middle, sitting right behind her, if you recognize that. And most of these people have passed as well. I love this photo. I call it Walker the Politician. This is on one of her many trips to Washington to argue for money to support the center. Funding from Washington, lobbying the congressman to do that. Anybody recognize anybody here? We've got some names at the bottom. Okay. The President Hefner at the time of Jackson State, Mike Parker, Joseph P. Kennedy, I think it was, David Dreyer from California. Walker, I think, is in his intense mode of saying, you need to fund this center. Can you imagine what this was like? And of course, we have images of it, which is what I love. She firmly believed in documenting instances like this, so we would have it. We now can see that that is what she was actively engaged in. And I end with the book that I hope won't take 20 years to do, because this book did. University Press of Mississippi is going to publish my Margaret Walker South. I could not do a second volume and do justice to what I felt was central to Walker's development and work, and it was her grounding in the South, her belief and commitment to the South and to Southern culture and the Southern work and lived experience. So that book is going to be called Margaret Walker South, and it is going to come out of the University Press of Mississippi. So that's for those of you who don't know who Margaret Walker is. The person that has given and did give all of her life to Mississippi, and in making sure that it was a place that not only she called home, that many people before her, during her lifetime, and subsequently would know as home, and that she felt honored by its acceptance of her as a young woman who came here in 1949. My journey to this book, the question I get asked a lot is why? Well, I pointed out that I'd helped Walker with 2 books, her essays, and there are probably 3 or 4 more books that could give us the rest of her essays. And there was really, rather than just keep producing the essays, I felt that it was important to tell her full story. And some of you have a brochure at your seat or at the table that shows some examples of what are now digitized collections as part of the Margaret Walker Center. Anybody who would leave their entire collection and argue for preservation in the way she did, how she got to that point in her life, why it mattered to her so much that an institute that would preserve the culture was absolutely essential. Those threads of her life, the many different parts of her life, I felt would be too easily forgotten if we couldn't put that story together in one book. I felt that I knew enough about how to tell the story. She'd left 2 unfinished autobiographies of her own that I had to draw on. But I had this incredible archive. Her entire archive went to Jackson State, the Margaret Walker Center. It was a gift. It was a biographer's dream and nightmare, because you have someone looking over your shoulder all the time when you're trying to tell that story. And literally, she would talk to me. Make sure I get it right. You didn't talk about this part, which is why it's as long as it is. I tried to get as much in as I felt I could in one volume. So I knew that this was not going to be a book that was celebrated necessarily in the New York Times or any of the famous, media outlets, because Walker continued to be the most famous person nobody knows. But if you wanted to know her story, I felt this book was necessary. If you wanted to know the significant contributions, the meaning of her life, why she did what she did, why she fought so hard, why the idea of for my people was a theme that penetrated her entire life. All the people. For my people meant all the people for Walker. That's what that poem says. Why it was that sense of responsibility, whatever she had, her skills, her strengths, her abilities, needed to be outward directed. She was, and I learned this term, and this is something that I have interesting discussions about with people, the difference between an educator and someone who simply sees himself or herself as a scholar. Walker was both. Educator for her was a broad term. You educate people in many different ways. You may be teaching them in the classroom, but almost all of the activities that she engaged in, that Fill It Sweetly Festival, were open to the public. They weren't private academic conferences. They were ways in which she could bring to everybody knowledge that could be shared, consumed, debated, appreciated. That was a life commitment she made. In the book, I try to talk about that in terms of being a preacher's daughter. She couldn't be a minister, but she was a preacher's daughter. And she brought that sense of sharing, gathering, convening, being part of a larger community, and giving oneself to that community. That was how she operated throughout her life. But she did it from Jackson, Mississippi. Lots of opportunities to leave. She left for visits, but never permanently. She saw most of her generation leave to go to other institutions that were perhaps more prestigious or certainly gave them more money, but she chose not to leave. It was Jackson where she was centered and remained centered. The longest journey for Walker, and one of the most difficult, was not Jubilee, the book that did take 30 years, more than that, because she started it in the 1930s and didn't publish it in 1966. The most difficult book was the Richard Wright biography, because it was embroiled in all kinds of lawsuits and that kind of thing. And I want to leave some time for conversations, but I want to read something from the book. And because we are approaching Eudora Welty's birthday, I thought I would read a little bit of a section in sort of a late blooming relationship with Eudora Welty, because they were both, Jackson's favorite women. The third of that triumvirate was Thalia Mara, of course. Those were Mrs. Jackson's women. They were the women who knew each other and that this city recognized with such great respect and honor. But that book was really difficult for Walker because it took a while to get published, not because she was standing in the way, but because everybody else was trying to stop it. The laws were trying to say, no, you can't tell that story. And she, of course, prevailed in the end. But it did take a lot out of her. But it also was what I call the end of a beautiful love story between she and her husband, because he was ill and dying of cancer, but he would not let go until she had penned the last word in that manuscript. So I want to read that section and then open it up for some questions that you might have. Walker called her husband comfortably Alex, and so I'm going to refer to him by that name. Walker and Alex both knew time was not on their side. With every chapter she finished, he grew more ill. He refused to go to the hospital, preferring instead to remain home to provide the support she needed to write more each day. She was in a race, not knowing when it would end, only that it would. The completion of the book kept both of them going. He knew that finishing the book was the one thing left for her to do, and he wanted her to finish it. It would close the door on that part of her life. It had not affected their lives together, but he knew that it was buried deep inside her, that bringing it out in the open would give her the peace that she needed. More important, he knew that he had to be there to help her finish moving it from the inside to the outside. She wanted him to get well, and each day having him beside her gave her reason to cling to hope. In late August, Alex consented to go to St. Dominic's Hospital. After a week of tests, they learned that he had developed a large gastric ulcer, but he refused to have surgery. Walker appealed to silent unity, one of the practices that she had in her life, reading passages aloud from the daily word and writing them in her journal to emphasize their power. She accepted his decision not to have surgery. And when he agreed to medication that would relieve some of the discomfort, she brought him home where he wanted to be, where she needed him to be. With Alex at home, she returned to her grueling writing schedule, and she completed the section of Wright in Paris and the years surrounding. By the end of September, she had finished the analysis of Wright's relationship with Africa and Pan-Africanism, including discussions of George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and Frantz Fanon. On October 13th, well ahead of her schedule, she entered a note in her journal that the book was completed. 6 days later, Alex finally consented to surgery and entered the hospital. After 8 hours of surgery on October 19th, he remained in intensive care. She never left his side, but wrote praise poems thanking God for bringing him through. On October 26, 1980, however, Ernest James Alexander died at St. Dominic's Hospital. The cause of death was heart failure, kidney failure, and cancer. They had been together 3 years shy of 4 decades. The book was finished, and so was their life together. On the morning before he died, she told him how much she loved him and thanked him for staying with her until the end of the most difficult book of them all. He had always known what she wanted and had given her the time she needed to do it. They had never changed. That had never changed. She accepted his death with conviction. And this is a quote from her journal. Alex died with dignity and pride. He was prepared to die, and he tried to prepare me, she wrote. None of their turbulent times came to her mind. She could only remember the good times they had together. Now a new phase of my life begins, she wrote in her journal 3 days after Alex's funeral. I am a widow a senior citizen, 65 years old, retired, with 4 adult married children and 5 grandchildren. Thank you, dear God, for Alex, for our life together, for all the years, and for our love you gave us to last a lifetime. Nationally, this new period of Walker's life was marked by the election of Ronald Reagan. The world was changing in ways that she struggled to understand, and again, she turned to her journal for self-clarification as much as she did for consolation. But it was the Wright manuscript that offered her the most joy. The manuscript was finally finished, her mission impossible, the last book that Alex had wanted her to complete. Without him, she felt an urge to accept engagements right away, because that too was something that she and Alex had done together. She needed something from their former life to make this new one bearable. To relieve some of the loneliness they knew she was feeling, Norma and Siggy, her son and daughter-in-law, moved into her home with their son Kahari. A second child was on the way, and they wanted Walker to feel pride in as much as ownership of this new grandchild, as if it might be possible to replace such a great loss. One other major adjustment had to be made, however, one that Alex had orchestrated. Siggy would replace his father as her companion on the road. He would drive and accompany her wherever she went. Like his father, Siggy had made a promise, one he would keep until the end of his mother's life. Assured of the necessary support, Walker began to plot a return to her professional life and to some degree of normalcy. In private, she was a grieving widow. In public, she maintained her local visibility and sought comfort in the invitations that began to pick up as interest in the Wright book grew. Her life had changed, but she needed the Jackson community to remember both of her identities, a nationally recognized writer and now the widow, Mrs. Furnist James Alexander. She did not submit to an older tradition of wearing black for a year. Instead, she began to believe that Alex had, and I quote, sacrificed his life for her career, a career that was far from finished. With this much discussed Wright book forthcoming, she was still in her prime. Life after Alex for Walker was a renewed commitment to the person she believed he had helped her become, the person who could do anything she set out to do. He did not allow himself to die until he was certain of her success at this next stage, a symbol of the covenant they had made as part of their marriage vows, she believed. Continuing to pursue her career with a passion meant more to her now than it did when Alex was alive. Shortly before Christmas, she received word that the Jackson City Council had approved renaming Gaines Street in her honor. That it was to become Margaret Walker Alexander Drive pleased her as she thought of Alex. More good news came when she received her first copy of the paperback edition of Poetic Equation, Conversations Between Nikki Giovanni and Margaret Walker. The book documented discussions that were even more relevant 6 years after its original release. In addition, Charlotte Moman, then head of one of the city's libraries, led a campaign for the Jackson Library Board to rename the Hinds County Library the Margaret Walker Alexander Branch in her honor. She was grateful when it occurred. Remembering her own days as a child at the New Orleans Library, she saw this development not only as a memorial to her, but also to, and I quote from the poem, Adams and Eves and their countless generations, announced so powerfully in For My People. She could have continued to enjoy the fruits of her earlier labors, graciously accepting the awards and accolades that were rapidly coming her way, but that would never be enough. She could not believe that the best part of her life was over. One sign of this was the invitation she extended to Eudora Welty to join her for tea. The two often met together publicly. They were the sister act, as Welty called them. By the 1980s, both women, one black, one white, had become the South's best known, most accessible writers. Because they both lived in Jackson, they could claim a unique position among the growing number of Southern writers who had been born after William Faulkner. Both had left the South and returned to it, vowing never to live any other place. Even though some years would pass before many Southern black writers could see themselves living in or reclaiming the South, Walker had embraced it fully. Knowing that she and Welty were the reigning women in Southern letters, Walker intended to remain as connected as possible to a tradition that had given her a secure and rewarding life as a writer. She also relished the idea of an identity that allowed her early radicalism to find an affinity with the new activism among a younger generation of women writers. In an era of growing conservatism, with Reaganomics in control, when others were muting their voices, hers would remain strong and forceful. She need not therefore let go of any part of herself as she entered the official period of old age. Several joint appearances with Eudora Welty at local and state events attracted a lot of attention. Walker was grateful for this display of support, but she was also aware of the perceived differences in their reputations. She knew that they lived in two very different worlds, still sharing a sense of their Southern heritage and an appreciation for what it meant for their work. Welty had popularized the phrase, a sense of place, just as Walker had added feeling tone. The pride in the South shared an equal place with the hatred of the South's social landscape, creating the tension that was a central element in Walker's poetry. Welty and Walker had used the professional boost that their WPA apprenticeships offered to enhance their powers of observation, which alongside their immersion into the local storied worlds of the South was put to good use. Welty was someone who took the path that Walker had not taken. She had earned Walker's respect by proving what was possible when a writer devoted her life to writing, even in an environment hostile to women. And while the Southern agrarians were quick to claim Welty as Faulkner's highly capable and most logical successor, Walker was among those who questioned why Welty would, and I quote, be labeled a member of the Faulkner School when she is so unlike him. She admired this independence, the ability to carve her own place in American literature as a Southern woman writer. Welty's 1973 Pulitzer Prize for her novel, The Optimist's Daughter, was a shared victory for the state of Mississippi, confirming the Magnolia State as a high-volume producer of the highest achievements in American letters. While Mississippi honored both women for their accomplishments, Walker understood the differences as being not so much racial, but financial. Had she not had to struggle financially, she might have been able to reap a larger share of the rewards that such dedication to one's art can bring. A full life as a mother, wife, grandmother, and educator had taken her in other directions, reducing her productivity, even as the choice had brought much meaning to her life. On the personal level, she felt fulfilled. She may have questioned, but never regretted her choice. Thank you. Questions? And Chris?
Got one right here.
Wonderful presentation. Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander taught both of my aunts, and just to hear how she inspired many of her students. And my Aunt Naomi Graham was at the Phyllis Wheatley Festival in '73, seeing Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez and many others. And she talked about how wonderful it was, even to this day. My question, has Dr. Margaret Walker Alexander ever been on the national scene reciting for my people, like on, I think he was known as Mr. Soul in the late 60s, early 70s, which would feature, I think he was Ellis Haslip, Nikki Giovanni, and other poets?
So yes, there were several. The heyday for her was between the 1960s and the 1980s. Wherever she spoke, she always recited for my people. She did it on radio, she did it on talk shows. She did have occasion to do that. Many of those were not recorded, not because she chose, because Walker was very conscious, I was talking to somebody earlier, of documenting everything. She documented the Phyllis Wheatley Festival. The images I have in the book are from photographers that she hired to document things. Very conscious of preservation, documentation, keeping a record. Again, video shot the Phyllis Wheatley Festival. They videotaped the folk opera Jubilee in 1976. I haven't found a copy of it, but I know it exists, and I'm still looking. So during that time, she would always be asked to read that poetry aloud, and she did do her last reading at a public event at University of North Carolina. I like to call it her last conscious reading. Her last trip, 1997, it was at the founding of a society in North Carolina, and she recited the poem, and many people remember that event. I remember her reciting it from heart when she was near death as well. I don't think she was aware that she was reciting it. She was in a wheelchair, it was in Chicago, and it was in front of a host of poets that were honoring her. But the problem is, many of those readings, again, did not get recorded. But yes, that was a national stage. She spoke everywhere. She always read aloud that poem. She had an audience that cared for her deeply. She had black media that cared for her deeply. At times, she would make it the crossover into the larger media, like the New York Times with the Phyllis Wheatley Festival. But for the most part, as journalists I interviewed said to me, that Walker was beloved by a distinct community. Mainstream journalists, less so than the black journalistic community. And that is where much of her work was directed. She had intimate relationships with many of those people. They covered the events, but it was primarily the black media. Because the black media began to lose a lot of ground and convert over to some other forms, that loss was also Walker's loss. So the national side of it in the later years, much less so than earlier. Yes, I see.
One back here. I'm going to ask a question from the live stream as I'm walking over to Rims. What do you think drove Margaret Walker's intense desire to create and to preserve?
Well, she came from a family of educators. People forget that sometimes. And I'm always finding myself explaining a tradition of black education that predates much of what we know today. Her mother, her father, college graduates. Her father had a master's degree in philosophy and religion from Northwestern University, of course, where Walker graduated. So she had a tradition, an understanding of the importance of knowledge and knowledge production and knowledge preservation. And of course, the Institute at Jackson State was founded with that purpose. It was founded with the purpose of preserving history, of preserving the record. And that record for her in Mississippi was crucial. So throughout her life, she saw that as a mission and felt that what she could do, what she could leave, the part of her legacy would have to be the center that bears her name now, but to have a place at an HBCU, that was important for her, where that documentation, preservation, and today digitization would be central. But it was very much in line with the tradition that she would have come from, that she understood. But she was the poet of history, she was a poet of memory, and she was a poet of preservation. And so those things were always central to her life. Thank you for that question.
Yes. Did you find her political activities, for example, she was a Jesse Jackson delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1984 and 88?
Yeah. So yes, that gave an opportunity. Let me start again. Walker was always political. There's no question. She read the left material from the 1930s. It guided her understanding of the world. Not necessarily her private practice, but it guided her understanding of world revolutions, world history, and transformation. She always had that mindset. She linked those ideas from the 30s with ongoing and changes in the United States throughout the 20th century. And so to that extent, she was linked to some of the most left-leaning intellectuals of the 70s and the 80s. Her personal choices aside, Walker was this deeply intellectually, politically advanced person. And when she wrote in her journals, you could see this. I did not include in the essay collections as much of the political essays because they needed a collection of their own. And perhaps it is time for us to do that, to collect those essays that are more politically driven. But that was always grounding for her. She understood the nature of our society, the nature of change, and she supported that work with her creative writing. As she said, her writing is her politics, and that is the way she looked at it. But she was deeply aware of much of the political scene. She went, as you say, in '84 to San Francisco as a delegate at large from Mississippi. She supported Jesse Jackson for president. He was, of course, the second black person to run for president after Shirley Chisholm, but that was her intent, was to support that. So her political activities came sort of late, after, if you don't count the 1930s. Political thinking was derived from the 30s. Political action, more direct, seemed to be came a little bit later, when she had a little bit more freedom, so to speak. Again, this all came after Alex had passed, after her children were out of the house. And in fact, she took everybody with her to San Francisco. There's a fantastic story about a train where the Walker Alexander family had the whole car to themselves. They had so much luggage and so many people, and it was a birthday party for her in July. She just had the whole train, and the conductor understood that this was a Margaret Walker event. But definitely the politics were there continuously, but surfaced at more sometimes than another.
Robbie, will you tell us a few things about what you've got over here for folks?
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, Maryemma. There has been no greater ambassador for Margaret Walker and the Margaret Walker Center than you, and so excited for this book and for seeing you here. My name is Robbie Luckett. I have the great pleasure of being the director of the Margaret Walker Center. A couple of things Maryemma mentioned. The Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival. This November 1st to the 4th, we are hosting a 50th anniversary reconvening. 10 of the original attendees are alive, 7 are returning. That includes Alice Walker and Sonia Sanchez and Paula Giddings. They will be an intergenerational conversation with 15 black women writers in all, including Jesmyn Ward, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, Amani Perry, Angie Thomas. It is going to be a groundbreaking event. You can find out all you need to know about the Phyllis Wheatley Poetry Festival on our website. Registration is available there, including the closing session with Dr. Graham that will feature her in conversation with Shelley Lowe, Chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Maria Rosario Jackson, Chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. It is really going to be a remarkable event, so join us in November. The second thing that we're working on at the center is a feasibility study to develop a new physical archive and museum on the campus of Jackson State University. We're engaged in a community engagement survey right now that we would love to ask you guys to participate in. We actually have physical copies of the survey on the table over here. We also have a QR code that you can snap with your smartphone and do it electronically. We're trying to get as much feedback from our community as possible on what you do know about Margaret, what you would know about the center that she founded and her direct legacy at JSU, and what you would like to see from the work that we have going on. So if you could help us with that today, we would really appreciate it. We do really hope to see you in November. Maryemma, I got one question for you. I don't think I've ever asked you before. I know you came to the festival in 1973. I'm wondering how you were introduced to Margaret Walker and what that was like for the first time.
Thank you for that question, and I think I've been able to answer it a couple of times because that was not my first meeting with Margaret Walker. I had been an exchange student at Northwestern University when I was an undergrad, and she had gone to Northwestern to spend a semester. And I heard that she was there. I tell this story. I think this is in the introduction to the book, so those of you who will read that in the introduction. I heard that Margaret Walker, who I knew because when I grew up, you recited that poem. You had to learn it by heart. You all know how long it is. It's a 5-minute poem. It's a 5-minute plus poem. I recited the poem, I knew it, and she was teaching at Northwestern. And I was like, I want to be in that class. Well, I wasn't a creative writer. She was teaching a specialty class. So I decided, in my boldness, my youth boldness, that I would go to her apartment and knock on the door and ask if I could come to her class. And her daughter, Margaret, answered the door and said, "Mom, there's a lady here to see you," and I could smell food from the door. That's another one of the treasures of Margaret Walker. She was an excellent cook. She was preparing dinner. I joined that dinner. That became a tradition among us. She would be cooking, and I would come and visit and have dinner. I did that a couple of times. I did get a chance to take the class unofficially because I was not a graduate student, couldn't do it. And so our relationship was just a moment. That was just a moment. I never expected that would be another opportunity. I thought it was a rare opportunity. When I was thinking about the grad school and was at Cornell, Betty Parker Smith, who is a known quantity here, who was at Tougaloo as a provost there until she retired, brought me to the festival. So she was the one that said, "You need to go to this program." And I stayed with her godmother because I didn't have any money. I was a grad student. So I came to Jackson State in 1973 at the invitation of Betty Parker Smith. I would not have known about it otherwise. But so that was my second encounter. And so in a sense, it was clear at that moment, probably I'd look back now, if I'd had that first experience and then came in 73, I had no choice but to spend at least some of my life making sure that Margaret Walker's life story would be known. So thank you for asking it. And thank you all for being here. I am honored.
Yeah. Thank you all. I hope we'll see you back next week when we'll have Daphne Chamberlain talking about the anniversary of the Jackson Children's Crusade. We have copies of The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker, for sale over here, and Dr. Graham will be glad to sign a copy for you and answer any questions you didn't get a chance to ask. Thank you again. Help me thank Dr. Graham for this fabulous program today.